Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Hernandez. I'm an outreach coordinator for the Housing Rights Center. Thank you for joining us today. Today, I'm presenting a fair housing workshop. And let's jump to our agenda for today. So in today's agenda, I'm going to cover the Housing Rights Center mission and services, fair housing laws, protected characteristics, prohibit practices, and disability accommodation request. The Housing Rights Center was founded in 1968 when the Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, and we are the largest nonprofit civil rights organization dedicated to fair housing. We serve two counties, LA County and Ventura County, and our services are free in many languages like Spanish, Korean, Chinese, Farsi, like any language. The Housing Rights Center provide free services, free housing counseling. That's one of our services. And the counseling is provide for tenants and landlords, or appointments are private and confidential. And during each session, we provide legal information, resources, and referrals on housing issues. To get in contact with our counselors, you can call us at 1-800-477-5977, or you can send us an email at info@housingrightcenter.org. And for people that with visual or hearing impairments, they can call us at 213-201-0867. Now, remember, if our counselors are not available, please leave a voicemail and wait for them to call you back. That usually takes like couple days because we're having a high volume of phone calls. But if you receive a private phone call, then please answer because it's more likely that is one of our counselors like returning your phone call. The Housing Rights Center also investigates discrimination in housing. We help tenants in the process to request reasonable accommodations. We mediate between tenants and landlords and help them to file a complaint with the with the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. If the case of discrimination is severe, we also represent tenants during litigation. We have another department, the Outreach and Education Department. I'm part of that department. And what we do is we participate in community events. We provide educational workshops like the one today, and we create Project Place. Project Place is an affordable rental listing, and it's available in our website at housingrightcenter.org/rental listing. And we update this document every month. So then you'll see fresh resources for people that are homeless and looking for a shelter, transitional housing. If you're a victim of domestic violence and don't know where to go, the information is there. If you're looking for a housing voucher, then you see the listing of all the agencies that provide housing vouchers. If you're a senior and looking for senior housing, you'll find that information there too. From all the providers that have openings for senior housing or people with disabilities that are looking for a place to live that is affordable for them and have the needs, the amenities that they need. So then you also find that information there. So now let's jump into fair housing laws. And let's start on how the fair housing laws apply to. So the fair housing laws apply to the following dwellings, like any apartment complex, any condominium, houses, duplexes, any residential motel, transitional shelter, mobile home parks, vacant lots, or any like short-term rental. The fair housing laws apply when people are renting, are buying, are lending, or they're being a prospective tenant, or they're a resident, they're like a current tenant. But there also are some exceptions for single homeowners when the owner lives with the tenant, and for senior housing. Who's responsible? Who is liable for discrimination in housing? The liability follows upward. So the landlord can be liable for discrimination in housing for any discriminatory practice by their staff members, by the manager, by the property manager, or directly from the owner. They're also liable if they hire a company, like let's say, for example, like to paint the property, and they and that person, that company that the landlord hire, like eventually do an act of discrimination against one of the tenants. So then the landlord is also responsible if that happens. Who is protected and what are the protected characteristics? The U.S. Fair Housing Act and the California Fair Employment and Housing Act protects people against discrimination when, again, when they're buying, lending, or being a prospective tenant. The act says that it's against the law to discriminate based on the following characteristics: race, their color of their skin, their sex, their family status, their religion, their national origin, and disability. Under familial status, the U.S. Fair Housing Act and the California Fair Employment and Housing Act protects the tenants' family status. The law protects any family with minors like 18 and younger, and those households that are expecting the arrival of one or more minors. For example, like someone that is pregnant, or people with the custody of a child, or in the process of obtaining the legal custody. Some examples of discrimination against families with children are locating families in a certain part of the property, like all the way in the back, or only on the first floor, or if the landlord or manager are creating like unreasonable occupancy restrictions, making like restrictive rules against families with children, or limiting the access to like to the children's or to the whole family for any service or any facility in the property. Another example of discrimination is creating ads that says like no children's are allowed, or adults only. So those are examples of like family status discrimination. Now, under national orange, the national orange of the tenant is also protected under the U.S. Fair Housing Act and the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. The law protects the tenant's country of birth and their ethnicity. And the law also protects like any cultural and physical traits, for example, their hairstyle, their clothing, if the clothing for a particular country, for a particular ethnicity. The law also protects the immigration and citizenship status of the tenant, their primary language, and also their accent. Some examples of national orange discrimination are denying rental application just because the tenant speaks Spanish only, or charging like a higher security deposit because the tenant is undocumented, harassing the tenant with ethnic slurs. That's another like example of discrimination based on national origin, or threat the tenant with eviction if they after they get a tattoo of the traditional culture or something related to their culture. So those are examples of like discrimination based on national origin. Now, the state of California, under the Fair Employment and Housing Act, protects the marital status of the tenant, their source of income, their medical condition, their gender identity, military or veteran status, their sexual orientation, and their ancestry. And I'm gonna speak about the source of income of the tenant, because in the Housing Rights Center, we have a campaign against discrimination based on source of income. We investigate those cases of discrimination in housing, and we take those cases seriously. So in the state of California, the source of income of the tenant is protected by the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, and under the bill SB 329. So the law protects the source of income of the tenant against discrimination. That means that the source of income cannot be the basis for differential treatment. For examples like advertisements against Section 8 recipients, rejecting an application because the tenant is paying with a housing voucher, like making a tougher application for those tenants that receive any financial aid, or having like a different rental rate for tenants that pay the rent with any help by the government. So under this law, the income standards of the tenant should be applied to the tenant's portion of rent only. And let me give you an example. For example, if Joy rent is $1,000 and he received like financial assistance of $900 a month. So that's his housing voucher, $900 a month. So Joe is responsible to pay $100 every month. So the income standard should be applied only to $100, to those $100 that Joe is responsible to pay. If the income standard of the landlord is 3 times the rent, that means that Joe needs to make $300 a month to meet the income standards of the landlord. So the question on this scenario is like, if the rent is $1,000 and the landlord is asking for 3 times the rent, and Joy makes $3,000 a month, but his housing voucher pays $900. So does he meet the landlord's income requirement? So that's the question. And I know it's a little bit confusing, but the answer to this exercise is yes. So the income standard applies to the amount of rent that the tenant will pay. So again, if the rent is $1,000 and the voucher pays $900, so the tenant is responsible for paying $100 each month. If the landlord standards is like 3 times the rent, he makes $300 per month, which is 3 times $100. So then, yes, he qualifies to rent that apartment. Now, landlords are allowed to request the income levels of the tenant to make sure they can afford to pay the rent. Landlords are also allowed to check the credit score of the tenant to make sure that they're going to pay the rent on time. They can ask for reference from other landlords just to make sure they were good tenants in the past. And the landlords are allowed to check the tenant's criminal record, but that's on case-by-case basis. And the landlord has to look for an actual concern for the safety of the landlord, for the safety of other tenants, or any property damages. For example, the landlord shouldn't reject an application from a tenant that had a misdemeanor that occurred 20 years ago. And since then, the tenant hasn't committed any other offense, and he's behaving really good, and that's the only thing on his record. So as long as there's no health and safety concern from against the landlord or other tenants, then that shouldn't the criminal history of the tenant shouldn't be the reason why the landlord can reject an application. But again, it's on case-by-case basis. Landlords also are allowed to have their non-smoking policy in their properties. They are allowed to reject an application if the tenant smokes. And they also can have their own pet policy, they can reject, they can accept pets, or have there's on this property we don't accept any pets. But they have to make an exception for this policy if the tenant has a disability and doesn't have a pet. Instead, they have an emotional support animal or service animal. So there is an exception for these properties that have non-pet policy. And I'm gonna talk about more in detail in a second. The state of California have additional protections for victims of domestic violence or victims of violent crime. They can request to change the locks with little notice and break the lease with lower penalties. The immigration status of the tenant is also protected under the Civil Code 1161.4. People over 40 years old are protected under the Unruh Civil Rights Act, Civil Code 51. This means that the tenant's age shouldn't be the main reason to reject an application, or the tenant's age shouldn't be the reason denying to rent an apartment house, or denying housing. So arbitrary reasons are any discrimination that I didn't mention before. For example, rejecting an application from a tenant who has a lot of tattoos, or dyes their hair green or purple, or wears piercings, and that's the main reason why they're being the application is being rejected, or housing is not being provided to that tenant. If the tenant is a victim of a hate crime, that shouldn't be the reason why the landlord will reject an application, make different rules for those tenants that are victims of hate crime, or request an additional security deposit. The law protects those victims under the Raub Civil Rights Act. And the tenant's primary language is also protected under the Civil Code 1632. The primary language of the tenant under this code is protected, and that means that the tenant has the right to negotiate the lease in their primary language. They can take their own interpreter who is like 18 years old or older. We recommend always like someone that is like 18 years old. And they can request a translation of the lease without additional cost. Now let's jump into like prohibit practices. So this is illegal discrimination. This is like things that the landlords are not allowed to do. So landlords are not allowed to refuse to sell or rent housing, saying that the housing is unavailable when it's actually available, like make any discriminatory statements or advertisements, do discrimination based on association, make any threats, any intimidation, intimidate the tenant, or make harassment or retaliation against the tenant, or deny a reasonable accommodation or modification of the unit for those tenants with disabilities, and otherwise make housing unavailable. So they're not allowed to do that. Like, and I have some examples of like discrimination and ads that are discrimination in housing, like no Section 8, that's an ad, a discriminatory ad. Children are not permitted outside in common areas. I don't believe in your trans friends' lifestyle, like don't invite them anymore. This is not an ad, but it's a phrase that the landlord can say to the tenant. Or would you prefer to look in a more like kid-friendly neighborhood, like something like a phrase that interfere that you shouldn't rent in that property, and then you should like rent somewhere else. So that's called steering, and steering is against the law. Like you have the right to rent in the place that you desire to live. Now let's jump into disability. So disability is any physical or mental impairment that limits any major life activities, like seeing, hearing, like walking, breathing, like performing manual tasks, any learning, any speaking disability. Some examples of disability are any visual disability, any speech or hearing impairments, like cancer is also a disability, any heart diseases like HIV, or any like related conditions, or any mental or emotional illness like bipolar disorder, anxiety, depression. Those are examples of disabilities. And tenants with disabilities, they have the right to enjoy their housing like people without disabilities. To achieve this, tenants have the right to request like changes or exceptions in housing related to their disability. So any accommodations or modifications requests that the tenant have to be directly related to the tenant's disability. When the disability is not apparent, like the landlord can tell that the tenant has a disability, they can request a verification that the request is necessary. That's called like verification letter. Tenants can obtain a verification, like a letter, from any reliable third party that it's familiar with the tenant's disability. For example, like a school counselor, their tenant's therapist, or any like support group, like someone that knows about the tenant's disability. So accommodations are changes to the services or the policy. And when the tenant requests an accommodation, the landlord bears with the cost. Some examples are changing the rent due date, switching parking spaces, transfer to another unit, allowing the tenant to have a living caregiver, or end the lease early or extend the time to vacate. Another example is waiving like the not pet policy that I mentioned before for tenants that need service or support animals. Modifications, like when the tenant like requests like any modification in housing, those are any like structural changes in the unit, like installing like ramps, grab bars, or lower countertops. Like in private housing, the tenant pays for the installation and the landlord has the obligation to grant the request. Now, what happens if in public housing? In public housing, if the tenant requests like a modification of the unit, then the provider like bears with the cost. Another thing that I want to mention is that if the landlord cannot comply with the tenant request, they have to give the tenant an alternative. Like they have to sit in a good faith and speak with the tenant and let the tenant know this is the other. This is the option that I have for you in order to comply with your accommodation or modification of the unit. And the tenant has the right to file a complaint against discrimination in housing with the Civil Rights Department, or they can call us and we can like investigate those cases of discrimination too. And this is the end of the presentation. Again, if you need to speak with the counselor, you can call us at 1-800-477-5977. For people with hearing or speech disabilities or visual disabilities, they can call us at 213-201-0867. Or you can send us an email at info@housingrightscenter.org. If you want to be part of our coming up workshops, we have workshops in online and in person and around all LA County and Ventura County. If you want to join one of our workshops and learn more about your housing rights, just check us out at our website, housingrightscenter.org/register, and then you can have access to all the workshops that we have. If you have social media, we are very active on Instagram, Twitter, Threads, and Facebook. We share information about educational workshops, but also about like what's going on in housing, resources. We let people know when project places out, if there's any financial assistance in your city, then we make or anything changing on any city, rent stabilizations, rent increases, like any update, then we publish that on our social media.